So welcome to a listening and sharing session, Water Access for Urban Growers. This is a collaborative effort between Sierra Club Illinois chapter and the Sierra Club Chicago group, as well as our new friends from Advocates for Urban Agriculture. I'm sure our time will fly by. I do want to express that this is and was designed one, to share information about who we are as our respective organizations and how it is water intersects with our work and is applicable to those who are growing agricultural foodstuffs or commercial non-edible products. And so we do wish for this to be as interactive and engaging as possible. And so we welcome your questions in the chat box. And we also, at the end of our presentation, have some time for collective questions and letting the conversation flow. All puns intended. So I do want to start off by saying thank you to my colleagues, my peers. My title at the Sierra Club is the Clean Water Advocate. I also call myself an aquaholic. Some people are like, what is that? I love water, especially the people kind, because we're made up of mostly water. Thank you to my colleague, Emmett Fruin, who is the Sierra Club Chicago group volunteer. We'll talk a little bit about the distinction and differences between the group and the chapter. And then Viviana Okakpu, who is the Advocate for Urban Agriculture Co-op Steward. Through the evening, you will hear from all three of us. And so we will be sharing the time together. This is our evening agenda. We will begin with some chat box introductions, and I deeply appreciate orienting us to how to use Zoom. Part one is going to be the Sierra Club, where we discuss who we are, what we do, how we do it, and bring your attention to two of some major issues from the conservation perspective as it relates to water, which includes nutrients, and forever chemicals that we reduce to calling PFAS chemicals, PFAS. Part two of our talk is Advocates for Urban Agriculture, them discussing more place-based at the garden level water accessibility and opportunities to engage in those conversations as growers. And then part three is the listening and sharing part, which we hope you do have lots of questions, concerns. We want to keep it really informal, but we also want to keep you all engaged. And again, thank you all for spending your Wednesday evening after such a powerful day. And if you attended the keynotes, it was inspiring to hear from all of the speakers. And I'm really excited to be a part of day one. So using the chat box function, if you, oh, Wendy, you're already on it. Please share your name, community, garden name, the side of town that you live on, maybe even your favorite crop, and what made you join tonight's call. So Wendy lives in Little Village. I absolutely love Little Village. Congratulations on opening up your farm on the South Side. And what a beautiful name for your alliance and coalition. So Wendy, is this your first time attending the Chicago Food Policy Summit? You can just type a yes or no in the chat box. You're so welcome. One of the things I love to do is kind of be my whole self. I am a yoga and meditation instructor. It helps me tremendously in doing this really challenging work. And so I do want to begin with the story of the outcasts and the forest fire. And so once upon a time, there were two outcasts from a village. One had no legs and the other was blind. Now, these two outcasts didn't get along. And so they were in the forest one day, and the blind man smells smoke, and he says and screams out to his nemesis, "There's a fire coming, we must get out." But the man with no legs looks around the landscape and doesn't see any fire and can't smell anything either. And so before too long, they hear the crackles and see the fire, and indeed they are in danger. And so in this moment, they had very few options. One of them was to attempt to escape on their own, but the man with no legs couldn't run fast enough, and the blind man couldn't see his way out. And so what they decided to do was work together. The blind man places the man with no legs on his back, and the man with no legs navigates them out to safety. I share that story because as a Black environmentalist, and I am a PhD in ecology and my focus was on food systems, I'm passionate about reminding people that we do have to work together. Policymakers, researchers, grassroots conservation, grassroots environmental justice, educators, artists, counselors, and therapists. It will take us all to deal with the changes in our climate, the changes in our landscape for the benefit of nature and humans. And so at the Sierra Club, we are a national organization, but we are separated by state. And so we call it the chapter. And I am a staff member at the chapter. We were formed in 1959, and our goal is to explore, enjoy, and protect Illinois. And we do so by working with the people of Illinois. Our state groups are broken up by geography. And so each group has its own name, and the boundaries define how it is they conceptualize their work. And so I have Emmett, who is a part of the Chicago group, because clearly this is the Chicago Food Policy Summit. In my role, I work on water issues across the state with multiple stakeholders. Mostly right now with farmers, as well as wastewater treatment facilities. But I do, and we do work at the municipal level, at the county level, at the regional level, as well as the state level. We are a C3 and C4, and so we also can lobby, as well as fundraise and educate. And so we bridge the gap between people and nature by novel storytelling. We speak for the system, meaning everyone. So when we say clean water for all, we mean for all, and for all stakeholders and land practitioners. And we do practice mindful movement building in terms of educating and supporting our volunteers to increase their equity perspective, as well as partnering in ways that reduces harm, because sometimes we don't speak the same language, or we believe we have similar goals, but maybe different priorities. And so a question for you all, in your opinion, why is it so important to understand and advocate for water as urban growers? And please do place your response in the chat box. And so thank you, Madison. I love kale. Welcome, Alvin. So why do you all think it's important to understand and advocate for water as growers? And from my perspective, we need water. I was the research coordinator at Eden Place Nature Center, and accessibility to water was the biggest issue. And it wasn't just water for the plants. We did have animals on ground, and we also had field trips. And so we had to think about potable water and drinking water, as well as sanitation, and with COVID, water for cleaning hands. And so for many growers, access to water or understanding how to irrigate, apply nutrients, all of those things are important because they do impact our water. And I'm going to ask for a time check. So Madison or Viviana or Emmett, if you could just drop me a line, I might have just a few more minutes left before I pass it over to Emmett. And so Illinois does have nutrient issues. The nutrients that we're most concerned with are nitrogen and phosphorus. These contribute to harmful algal blooms within freshwater as well as saltwater systems. Currently, Lake Michigan does not have algal bloom problems. However, there are waterways in the state of Illinois that are experiencing eutrophication. And thank you, Wendy, water is life. I completely agree. Algal blooms can create odorous issues. It is toxic. And so if you have a pet and they're out and they consume it, they also could perish. And it is just, it wreaks havoc on the entire system. Drinking water as well as water for recreation. So a bit about eutrophication. Oftentimes, people conceptualize Sierra Club as being so big, we're only focused on conservation of wild and natural lands, but with 80% of people living in cities or will be living in cities by 2050, I believe, it's important to acknowledge what we do here and the number of actors and the concentrations of applications of chemicals can actually cause problems downstream. And so nutrients are food. All bodies of water need them and all living things need them, but sometimes they get too much. The sources of those nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, can come from agricultural runoff, from fertilizer, combined animal feeding operations, urban runoff, wastewater discharges, CSOs. Now, what does this have to do with where you all are located in Chicago? Well, we all contribute to this issue. Illinois nutrient runoff actually helps produce the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And so there is an intentional push to help farmers and those within the agricultural sector reduce their nutrient inputs, change their soil practices, moving over to regenerative agriculture, or in cities, being more sustainable or climate friendly, organic, for lack of a better word, because we wish to protect systems downstream, as well as protect the integrity of our system that supports us. And so when working with water, you may only believe or conceptualize it as irrigating your crops. But the more informed we are as stakeholders, constituents, voters, we can begin to piece things together. There are some farmers that start here in Chicago and they move out and get more land, and now they're finding themselves in rural central Illinois or northern Illinois. And so scaling up practices can create harm. But this is to help you understand point source pollution and where it comes from. It's contamination that can be traced to a specific point, possibly from the discharge from a wastewater treatment plant. And I'll give you 500 fake points if you answer me, what is the wastewater treatment facility that services Cook County? And you can drop that in the chat box. But point source contaminants can run off into our waterways. This is just a kind of big picture, how much each sector contributes to phosphorus and nitrate. And so on the left side of your screen, you'll see phosphorus. Blue is for human wastewater's contribution, red is for urban runoff, and green is for agriculture. As you can see, it's about a 50-50 split between phosphorus from human wastewater and from agriculture, with a tiny sliver being from urban runoff. Chicago is the largest city in the state, and so even though we don't contribute as much as agriculture does. And if you look at nitrate, which is on the right side, you'll see that overwhelmingly agriculture and the application of nitrogen fertilizers contributes nitrates to the system. And so I will take a pause. Yeah. Welcome, Gina. And yes, you are absolutely right, MWRD. So again, in the chat box, what is the name of the river that carries Chicago's treated wastewater? And so because you are practitioners on urban parcels, if you are next to a drain or you have a service line or a toilet, this river carries your waste. What's the name of it? And you can Google it and drop it in the chat box. So while you're kind of figuring out what river that is, this is the Mississippi River that ultimately receives our discharge water. Chicago is the only city that is legally allowed to draw water from Lake Michigan and not return it. And so with the reversal of the Gina, the Chicago River, our water flows down the Illinois and into the Mississippi River. This river is America's longest. It's the busiest commercial waterway, and the nutrients mobilize down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. And so why is this important? My family's from Louisiana. There are shrimpers and there are fishermen that rely on a healthy ecosystem. And if Illinois farmers or those in agriculture are contributing to decimating these waterways, it's important that we step back and see water differently, especially for those farmers, ranchers, and fishermen that are downstream.
I'm sorry to interrupt really quickly, Dr. Mila, Marshall. I just want to give a moment for our translators to switch roles quickly.
Sure.
Thank you so much. All right, thumbs up from Emiliano.
Wonderful, and thank you, because
Amazing.
I can't see any faces.
Awesome, thank you. You can continue. Appreciate the interruption.
You're welcome. So with climate change, we will see even larger dead zone areas during our summer months. And so again, if you are someone who travels, has relatives, or if you're simply a person who loves water and people, understanding how we contribute to harming our waterways through agricultural practices, no matter how small you are, is really important, because you might only have a 25 by 125 parcel, but your vote is much bigger than that. And your influence in pushing state representatives to protect water everywhere and support sustainable agriculture is really important. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Emmett, while you all ponder, what are some sources of pollution that concern you? And have you ever heard of PFAS before? Type it into the chat box. And Emmett, I will go off mute and let me know when to advance the slides.
Okay, thanks, Mila. So my name is Emmett Fruin. I'm a volunteer with the local Chicago water team. We do beach cleanups. We do educational events. We also have a water sampling team, and we have a blog where we record the water samples. So we monitor like pH and conductivity and measures of water quality. Thank you, Mila. So I'll be talking about PFAS. PFAS are forever chemicals. They have a technical name based on their molecular structure. It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, but you can just think of them as PFAS. They're found in a lot of different consumer products, as well as firefighting foam, paint, medical equipment. They're used because they're resistant to heat, oil, and water. Next slide. They're man-made. The Environmental Protection Agency and industrial manufacturers have known for decades that they're harmful. They cause cancer and other health issues in humans and animals. Michael Hawthorne wrote a couple of articles in the Chicago Tribune. He explains PFAS builds up in the human blood, takes years to leave the body, and doesn't break down in the environment. Next slide. PFAS are relevant for urban growers because they're found in biosolids. Biosolids are the product of sewage treatment and are used as a fertilizer. And a lot of urban growers are the MWRD, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, offers these biosolids for urban growers, but they can be harmful. Next slide. There was another source of information for this presentation is the Sierra Club investigation. Sonia Linder, pictured there, was one of the researchers. And the Sierra Club tested dozens of fertilizers, or identified dozens of fertilizers, and tested 9 of them from several different states, and found that 8 of 9 had high levels of PFAS. So not every state has regulations on PFAS. A lot of them don't. Maine is one state that does have environmental regulations, and Maine was used as the standard for determining high levels of PFAS. Next slide. Many home gardeners buy compost or commercial soil, fertilizers to enhance soil nutrition. But again, a lot of these biosolids or fertilizers made with biosolids have PFAS in them. Next slide. If you remember nothing else from the presentation about PFAS, remember keep PFAS out of your garden, avoid products made from biosolids, residuals, or municipal waste. You can check the label on fertilizers to see if there are biosolids in the fertilizers. You can ask the supplier for compost and topsoil. And there's a website you can go to for more info, sc.org/PFAS-sludge. Next slide. So here's some more information about PFAS and biosolids. So half the sewage waste generated in the U.S. is treated then spread on agricultural lands. 15 in 2020, half of biosolids from the MWRD were spread on farmland, and 15% were spread in gardens and were sent to gardens and landscapers. So they are still being used commonly. The main reason for their use is to reduce, reuse, and recycle. If you think about manure being used to fertilize crops hundreds of years ago, well, now it's we use the sewage end products, sewage treatment end products, but there are issues with these forever chemicals ending up in the biosolids, and we don't want those forever chemicals in crops in our food system. Next slide. So PFAS enters waterways by being legally discharged from homes and commercial facilities. When you wash your clothes, some of your clothes might have PFAS in them. So that's one source of PFAS entering waterways. The best way to deal with PFAS is to stop producing products with it and to stop purchasing products with it. PFAS are largely unregulated. The EPA has been slow to take action, and many states don't have regulations for PFAS in drinking water or in biosolids. Next slide. Yeah, I switched the order. Can you go to the dark dark waters. Yeah, thanks. So really helpful film. If you want to sort of hear a real encouraging story. Can you go to dark waters, the next one?
Yeah, it's skipping on me. I'm sorry.
Oh.
If it crashes, I'll just pop it back up. So
Okay. So it's a movie with Mark Ruffalo. And I was able to join a Sierra Club presentation. I got to hear from the protagonist of the story is this lawyer, Rob Balot, who he works to expose DuPont's activities and bring justice to victims who develop cancer and other diseases because local waterway was polluted when DuPont dumped PFOAs, PFAS chemicals in the waterway. There was a farm near their dump site, and the cows on that farm died after developing blackened teeth, tumors, and bloated organs. So the farmer called Rob Balot, and Rob Balot sort of he didn't want to take the case, but he ended up taking the case and spending years and years, and it cost him a lot of stress, and he even developed health problems working the case. But the movie sort of exposes how far some corporations will go to cover up their wrongdoing and to avoid acknowledging the harms that they've caused. So I highly recommend it. Rob Balot is victorious in the movie in fighting for justice for these victims. Eventually, DuPont is ordered to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars in claims for victims of the PFAS, the chemicals in the water. Next slide. So PFAS are discharged from industries like DuPont. Manufacturers of many different types of products. And current sewage treatment options will not fully destroy or contain PFAS. So they end up in biosolids because there's no way to separate out the PFAS from the other sewage waste. Incineration is energy intensive and may not break down the PFAS, and can spew PFAS into the air and surrounding area. So incineration is not really an option either. Next slide. So 22% of biosolids are disposed of in landfills, but PFAS can leach out of landfill liquid waste and be hard to contain. So what is to be done about PFAS if they're in biosolids that should be used to fertilize crops, and even if they're disposed of in landfills, they can leach out into the groundwater. Well, you could compare PFAS to heavy metals and toxic chemicals from the 70s. There's actually a similar issue in the 1970s where the EPA got involved because biosolids had heavy metals and toxic chemicals in them. They took out a full-page ad to notify people not to use biosolids. And eventually, regulations caught up, and those same heavy metals and some of the toxic chemicals are no longer found in biosolids, but we do have still PFAS. You could also compare PFAS to like plastic pollution, microplastics in our waterways. And so hopefully over time, regulations catch up, and more testing is done, because as it is now, treatment plant operators are not required to routinely test for PFAS. So there's really a lack of regulations and a need to develop new ways to destroy and deal with PFAS. Next slide. So here is one final graphic, just summarizing the issue with PFAS. It's used in manufacturing. It can, even if it's landfilled, it can leach into groundwater. It goes to the sewage treatment plant, and then it's treated, but then it might be discharged back into lakes and streams, or it's ends up in biosolids that can contaminate crops, and then we eat then it's in our food system. So it's so, if take nothing else away, be careful about the fertilizer you use, avoid biosolids, but also just remember this is a big issue, and the more people know, the better. I think that's it. Next slide. So I'm passing it back to Viviana, or back to Mila.
Viviana, yes.
Thanks, Emmett.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to encourage everybody to take a deep breath, because I know that's some heavy information to know, the magnitude of what we are working within, just trying to grow food and crops in the Chicagoland area. And as you do that, I encourage you to consider the question, what are some ways you collect and irrigate water in your gardens? And if you feel like it, please enter that into the chat. Right. So my name is Viviana. I'm the co-operation steward with Advocates for Urban Agriculture. We're an organization that's been around since 2002 and we are a coalition of urban farms, communities, and school gardens, as well as individuals and urban farm businesses, working together to support expanding urban agriculture in the Chicago region. The organization was brought together by different growers experiencing lots of issues they encountered trying to establish urban farms and community gardens in the Chicago region. Excuse me. And, currently in our current iteration, we are an entirely grower-run organization, and we most definitely are centering growers in all of the work. We do this through technical assistance. So supporting folks in their water access, soil testing, et cetera. We also do this through capacity building grants, as well as advocacy work and popular education. Go next slide, thank you. So, we're considering a lot here. And I, can't talk about water without acknowledging that Chicago has a lead problem, right? Certainly in our service lines, and the process of getting that removed has been way too slow, but I think it's also important to acknowledge some of the past soil work that we've done with Dr. Andrew Margonat from U of I through the Safe Soils Initiative that was conducted from 2018 to 2020. On lead levels in Chicago soils. So when we're talking about runoff, that's also something to be considering. And also for growers and farmers, if you're interacting directly with the soil, it's definitely something to be mindful of. So when working with Dr. Margonat, I learned that 20 parts per million for lead in a soil sample is just that's the naturally occurring level. That's typical, right? They also tested biosolids to see the lead content in there, and it was clean as far, or it was clear as far as not above 20 parts per million for lead in biosolids. However, in doing good sampling and samples that were submitted by different farmers and gardeners across Chicago, found that there's quite a bit of lead that's in our soils. The federal and therefore the Illinois EPA maximum standard for lead in soils is 400 parts per million. Whereas in California, it's 80 parts per million. And that was set at their state level by more medical considerations of like the physiology of humans, right? So 80 parts per million being that like probably that max you want to see. But unfortunately, when they surveyed Chicago, 100% of Chicago was above that 80 parts per million in the locations that were sampled. I will acknowledge that there was grid sampling that was done in parkways. So that sort of lead legacy of leaded gasoline in the past, absolutely contributing, but the fact of the matter is it's still present in soils that we potentially could be working as well. So I encourage everybody to reach out to soil@auachicago.org. That's Yadi would be on the other end of that, and they are supporting our soil testing program that we're doing right now. So if that's something that you're interested in. Next slide, please. And over the last several years, AUA has been on a journey alongside our partners at NeighborSpace, the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, as well as the Chicago Food Policy Action Council to address water access for growers at the city level. You're seeing here a student at a garden watering with a jug gallon. That's a pretty common thing. But I think about so many people that are doing that, especially our elders who are carrying and lugging water back and forth. And it really shouldn't be this hard to do what is, what I view as an ecosystem service for our communities, right? In 2018, we began conversations addressing it with the city on how to improve water access for growers. At that time, a lot of folks were using fire hydrants for water access, and it was about that time, 2018, when it really ramped up in 2020 to prevent access for growers from hydrants. It just became more expensive. There were a lot more barriers that were put in place. And, this is still something that we're dealing with today. Can you advance to the next slide, please? So one of the things that we've done to counter this is formed a whole program around water access. Shout out to Tucker Kelly, who is our water access steward. So if you have any questions about water access for your growing operation, feel free to reach out to water@auachicago.org. You'll find them. Some of the ways that we support growers in getting access to water, we definitely want to look at holistically what are there multiple possibilities for accessing water, recognizing that hydrants are typically a last resort if you can't get water through other means, whether it's you have on-site water access, which is ideal scenario, sometimes working with a neighbor or a neighboring building and making sure that you have a clear contract on what that agreement is. However, for the hydrant access, which is what a lot of locations end up using, we do hydrant application support. So going through that whole city process, navigating all the city departments you might need to encounter, as well as getting the equipment certified. So as of 2020, what you'll need in order to link up to a hydrant, you need something called an RPZ, or reduced pressure zone valve. And what that does is it prevents any water in your water line or in the hose from going back into the main water line and potentially polluting our collective water source, right? So we support in getting access to that equipment, making sure that it's certified and functioning properly, and then also supporting covering the cost if that is a need. Advance to the next slide. Another ways that we support, if you choose to access water through a hydrant, is through custodian cap removals. Custodian caps are something that typically gets put on after somebody makes a call to an alder's office saying that they found an open hydrant, or if there's been, tops have rolled by too many times and the hydrant has been open, right? This is when a cap will typically get put on. There is some disparities in where they are distributed throughout the city, so I'll just acknowledge that. The custodian cap is in the photo on the right side, so you see that little gold thing on the top there. These two hydrants, the photos are taken a block away from each other, so it's kind of random where they end up getting put on. So if you do see one in proximity to your community garden, you choose to use it, just know that the process is going to take longer to be able to get access to water through that hydrant. We also support folks in getting legal support, so making sure that your land tenure and your what's called right of entry is appropriate to be able to access hydrant, because there are new restrictions around that about being able to access a hydrant for your community garden if you don't have legal right of entry on that particular parcel of land. It's also required to have insurance in order to get access to a hydrant. So that's another form of support that we offer. Definitely want to support folks in negotiating alternatives to hydrants, like I mentioned before, and best practices if you're going to be working with a neighbor. Again, want to underline the necessity for clear definitions of how it's going to work and who's getting paid what. But these are just some of the broad support that we offer growers to making sure that they can access water, recognizing that hydrants are a last resort for water access. Next slide, please. So time for a little bit more discussion. We want to hear from you. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat box or come off of mute. Let's keep this conversation going. Let us know what questions you have.
Thank you so much, Viviana. And we're going to leave this slide up because it is time for us to listen to you. So just as a recap, we have nutrients, PFAS, PFAS, lead in soil, as well as resources for identifying water for your garden. I'm going to begin by responding to some of the questions that were given earlier. So let me just scroll back up. Thank you for responding to how do you access your water for irrigation. And so Madison shared straight from the spigot. Steph also shared depending on rain and a trusty hose, probably with some Gorilla Tape on it if you have it attached and like running it from another location. Wendy shared, I use rainwater to water flowers and the water hose for veggies. Tucker shared, I use municipal hydrant water, good old fashioned rain. And Tucker treats the hydrant water for harvest and sanitation. Oh, wonderful, you're at UICS where I graduated from, and of course, where to source drinking water. So in Emmett's presentation, he said a really important word where he discussed that there is a legal amount, which is whatever people discharge. And have you all ever heard of water permits? Yes or no? And you can come off mute, you can type it in the chat box. Have you heard of water permits before? If not, there are varying regulatory agencies that give permission for a company or a facility to discharge contaminants or pollutants or wastewater back into the natural world. That can be the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, which is given regulatory oversight by federal US EPA. There's also not for discharge, but for changes within the landscape of water, like dams, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, or even the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And so in order to remove or regulate the removal of a contaminant, it is a process, and the public engaging on permits that companies have to ask our Illinois Environmental Protection Agency permission to pollute is a way that we as stakeholders can push back on what's being released. So thank you, Viviana, for sharing. I'll start from the bottom. Jennifer asked, is there any data sources showing lead, PFAS contamination in the Chicago region? So also, if you are an attendee and you know any of these questions, you can place STACK, STACK, and that will give us the order of how to get your responses. Viviana shared lead data, PFAS data, yes. the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, I believe beginning in 2019, surveyed drinking water, municipal drinking water systems to identify the presence of PFAS chemicals and found that they are present. There is currently an issue with a company, 3M Cordova, that has been polluting the environment for decades with PFAS chemicals, and now they're being held accountable. Unfortunately, this chemical is really scary, and the way that information is getting out, it's kind of patchy. And so you'll have people whose ears perk up like, wait, what am I using on my foodstuffs? Am I consuming this? How do I avoid it? And at the moment, it's either, well, first of all, we have to stop making it, like Emmett expressed in his slides. We also have to make remediation and removal of it affordable, because there are markets for contamination. And so it's a problem to be solved, which means there's lots of money in it. However, Emmett also expressed that there's over 400 of these chemicals in different forms. And so the remediation or abatement might only be for a certain subset of those PFAS chemicals. And we're still learning a lot. And it is our hopes that IEPA will begin to regulate PFAS discharge, or PFAS being mobilized through wastewater, as well as biosolids. There was another question. Let's see. Can I go up? I saw one about fungal remediation of water. Who was that? Was that Carmen or?
That was Wendy Hernandez had asked, how can we pressure the county to use mycelium fungi to remediate waterways?
So Wendy, would you mind coming off mute and chatting a little bit about your familiarity with this process?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I've read some articles where they've used mycelium to like clean up the oil spills in the Gulf, I think, of Mexico. So I was just wondering if we could also do the same with these forever chemicals.
So Emmett, would you like to kind of respond to kind of like from the perception of like water sentinels testing, how it is that the Chicago group works with local officials to get things done as it relates to water?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about mycelium. I don't know if that could be used, but yeah, we do some lobbying, like legislators, and we've been doing this citizen water sampling program for a while. There are some other organizations that do water sampling. Ours is just voluntary. We do it ourselves and then record it. But I think we just had our beginning of the year meeting. I wasn't able to attend, but one of the issues that we might try to work on is understanding how the different local organizations work together more to see if we can share more information with them. There's a lot of what we do is educational activities and just like beach cleanups. So yeah, there are some other local organizations who are more connected to like the regulations and operations of the waterways. So yeah, we're still growing.
Thank you, Viviana.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a mycelium nerd, so I could share a little bit about what I know in relation to your question. Um, so from what I understand and what I've learned from soil scientists is that when it comes to PFAS, yes, there's several hundreds of them, but about only 40 of them can even be tested in a lab and be able to identify and quantify how much is there. So it would be a process of being able to identify which type of mycelium would be able to metabolize the PFAS in the waterways first. But if we can figure out a viable option for that particular, being able to one, identify which are the chemicals, and then two, pair that with an appropriate mycelium, and then being able to create it in mass to be able to place in the waterways, we can figure that out. I think that could be a potentially great way, and definitely put pressure behind it to start cleaning up our waterways.
Thank you for that additional context, Viviana. And Wendy, to follow up on that, can we put pressure at the county level or any level to adopt or use particular remediation practices? And the answer is yes, but we do that together. And so we work with entities or organizations that are environmental lawyers, for example. Illinois Environmental Council is a coalition of greens and blues, typically nonprofits that leverage our membership to put pressure on pieces of legislation. A good way to think about how urban agriculture has been or has benefited from that sort of lobbying is cannabis. While some people see that as simply a social equity tool to reverse the harm on the war on drugs, for example, we do have the greenest legislation in the nation, and that was on purpose. The creation of that made sure that this agricultural commodity that many people completely are new to was not overusing or misusing the resources that we currently have right now. So for example, cannabis uses 8 times the amount of water that corn does to produce the same yield post-harvest. If we're not careful about inviting growers to plant commodities that require a ton of water, require a ton of nutrients, we will be faced with a new population of stakeholders that are pitting profits against the resilience of the system. And so we have to change legislation. And that's one thing that we do really well is help our members, volunteers, the
Uh-oh, it looks like we may be lost Dr. Marshall. Hopefully she will join back shortly. But in the meantime, are there any other questions that anyone in the chat has for Viviana or Emmett?
I think Mila was talking about water consumption. That's a big issue. We live in the Great Lakes region, so we're sort of more resilient to drought, but that's a really big issue that's affecting the West. Aquifers are being drained. People are pumping water to irrigate fields, and the Colorado River is decreasing in its flow because of all the water usage, the over usage in the West. So it's a good thing just to keep in mind in general. It's how much water we consume, make sure we live in harmony with nature. Chicago has sort of the opposite problem in terms of like risk of flooding. You know, people know Chicago was built on marshland, and so now we have a system, a drainage system that helps prevent Chicago from flooding, but with rising sea levels, there is definitely risk for more flooding in the future.
And I see we have Dr. Mila Marshall joining us again. Welcome back.
Thank you. It like disappeared and I was like, what happened? So I apologize for that. But thank you for continuing the conversation. I cannot share my screen now.
Because I
I have an interesting fact. I was talking about flooding. If anyone was curious about the lake levels, I learned that the water levels rise and fall in like a decade. They could rise or fall several feet. So right now they happen to be high, but that doesn't, it's not necessarily from climate change. It just might be random fluctuation in the lake levels.
Okay. Thank you all. Any other final questions about accessibility to water, fertilizing? Does anyone want to share your tensions for the upcoming season around water? What are your major concerns? And you can come off mute or you can type it in the chat box. So when thinking about nutrients from my perspective, there are many studies that discuss the over-fertilization of urban yards and lawns, for example. There is a belief that all urban growers or population of urban growers are really sustainable and organic. But oftentimes that might not be true, and it might be different from grower to grower. And so when there's turnover in leadership or the removal of knowledge and wisdom because people move on, or a garden or farm no longer has its lease, or there are new people that are kind of leading the way, you can have changes within your management practices or even people's understanding about what is an option. So Viviana, in your experience as someone working with growers in the city of Chicago, would you say that sustainable water use is a common practice? So collection through rain barrels and things like that.
Sure, yeah. I think it's safe to say that, because folks are usually drawn to this work already, consider themselves, some form of an earth steward, right? Looking towards conservation and recognize our ecological impacts, right? So I would say that's pretty common. A lot of rainwater harvesting. We in the past have distributed rain barrels as well. However, there is some there's some more guidance that's occasionally needed around the surfaces on which the water is collected, because there's potential for contamination from, say, for example, if it's collected off a roof and a bird flies by and leaves its dropping there, right? And so then that could also then accumulate in the water source as well. So it's just a matter of being mindful of what's coming out of the spigot at the end, and what type of crops you're putting it on, and how much time you leave before you harvest that crop, if it's an edible one.
Thank you. So Emmett, in your work as a volunteer, can you talk about why it is you started participating in the Sierra Club on the water side?
Oh yeah. Well, I found I was looking for places to donate money. I stumbled upon a list of the top organizations that have the most influence, where your money goes the farthest, environmental organizations. So Sierra Club was up there. Coalition for Rainforest Nations was another one that I donate to. That has a really big impact. Sierra Club has a grassroots, is a lot of grassroots efforts and some political power. So I think that's what makes donations to Sierra Club effective. But I started donating, and then I forget how I got involved with the water team. I found an opportunity through my basic involvement with Sierra Club through donations, and I just kind of stumbled upon it, and I knew that water issues were important. I had just like a really basic concept that water issues were important, but I went to a couple of meetings just to check it out, and then I took it. I thought that was really interesting, and so now I'm involved.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Viviana, when working with new growers, what's the learning curve as it relates to water across the entire parcel? Do you feel as though people have a pretty good understanding about, we need drinking water, we need water for sanitation, we need water for irrigation? Or do you feel as though when people come to you, they're a bit, they have kind of like the blinders on about water?
I definitely don't think it's a one size fits all, because people come to this work through so many pathways, right? So there's all different types of knowledge that folks come with. I will say that generally, if you have a water access on site, there's only one source, unless you're bringing it on site. So that differentiation between potable, non-potable use, like that, it's really not what's coming out of the spigot, but rather, or hose, etc., but rather what's happening to that water afterwards. So is it treated before you use it as wash water? Is it treated before you drink it, right? Or is it just being used for irrigation, and that's not really part of a necessary step there? So there's a lot of variation there.
Thank you. So I will let each of you have kind of like your final comments that you would like for growers to take away moving into spring and the next growing season. What are some tips or levels of mindfulness, or even opportunities to stay engaged with you moving forward?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, AUA has an active water access program. Tucker Kelly, who is currently in the room, is our water access steward with Advocates for Urban Agriculture. Again, they can be reached at water@auachicago.org, and they'll be working to support growers throughout the season on accessing water from multiple ways, right? Whether it's through a hydrant and the big old complicated process that is, or any of the other means of accessing water as well. We also have a number of different programs throughout the year, including our Farmer to Farmer mentorship program. If that's something that you would really love to get specific mentorship on, I encourage you to check out our interest form on our website as well. Our website, I'll drop it in the chat as well. It's auachicago.org. We're here to support. If you're a grower in the Chicago region, we're here for you. That's the whole point of our organization. And we definitely want to see as much food grown locally as possible. So check us out, reach out. We're here for you.
Thank you. Oh, Emmett?
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have much advice. I keep up the good work. It's, local food is really important. But if you want to reach me, you can look me up on LinkedIn. Would be a good way to go. Yep.
And I will close by saying thank you to my peers, my colleague. This has been tremendous. It is my hopes that we recognize the importance as growers using water, that we also translate to other people and other industries on the sustainable use of it. There will be conversations where your voices will be really impactful, and your practices as well. And so with that, I want to say thank you so very much to Chicago Food Policy Summit for this beautiful collaboration and inviting the introduction with AUA, because that did not exist. And again, we focus on clean water for all. Thank you all for such a wonderful evening, and I'll turn it back over to Madison.
Awesome. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you all so much.